Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Goddu, and I'm kicking off today's webinar on leadership and culture make the difference in safe world-class performance. And I'm just going to pause for a sec, hoping everyone can hear me. I've got a colleague on the phone. I presume this is working. He'd be yelling in my ear right now if it wasn't working. Thanks for joining and giving me the opportunity to present today on dynamic safety leadership and culture. Again, my name is Mike Goddu, and I'm a co-founder of JMJ. JMJ provides consulting to heavy industries worldwide, including Australia. I'm on the line from the US, so it's in the evening here. But I spent 4 years in Perth, not that long ago, leading work throughout your country, and then 7 years overseeing JMJ's work across Australia, New Zealand, and all of Asia. In Australia, while there, I supported the development, along with my teams, we supported the development of strong safety cultures in Australia: mines, ports, tunnel, offshore operations, LNG plants, large construction, the Shell Prelude vessel, and more. I loved living and working in Australia, and I look forward to returning for a visit. It's been a long time with COVID, as you know, even more than I do. I want to introduce briefly Paul O'Keefe, a senior consultant of JMJ, who's on the line with me. Paul lives in Perth and has active engagements in safety culture across Australia currently and beyond. He and I have spent more than a few early mornings on his small fishing boat off of Mindarie, if I'm saying that right, Paul, just north of Perth.
Yeah, that's right.
He not only catches more fish than me, but is an excellent pilot. And hopefully he'll keep this ship afloat and help me off any sandbars we hit in the course of this webinar here today. Paul, thanks for being here. And I know you'll help take questions and speak up.
My pleasure.
I'm going to say a few words about JMJ and our clients, and then I'm going to ask you to participate, those of you joining us in this webinar, by chatting. I understand that you can't speak up. The form of Zoom that we're on, it's the presenters who speak, and you all participate by chatting. But first, a few words about JMJ. Again, we're 35 years old, and we're known globally for shaping organizational culture, for leadership development at all levels in the organization, not just executives. High performance and very safe operations. And in particular, kind of what we're really noted for is engagement of the workforce, supervisors and workers who are working safely and working productively, not because they have to, not just for paycheck, but because they want to. And a few words about our global clients. Again, we've worked across the world. Both Paul and I have extensive global experience, and I've mentioned some clients already in Australia: Chevron and Shell, QG on the oil gas side, KBR, Lend-Lease, and a number of other large contractors, BHP, Rio Tinto, a gold miner, Boeing in manufacturing, Toll, and other logistics companies. So we have really quite the experience there in your backyard. Just to get this started and have you participate so you don't just listen to one or two talking heads here for 45 minutes. Hey, what's the difference, in simple words, between managing safety and leading safety? So this is dynamic leadership as a key pathway for safety performance. Well, what's the difference between managing safety and leading safety? And Paul, in your words, maybe a few words: managing safety and leading safety?
Yeah, so for me, I think this is a really important conversation. If I think about managing safety, I quite often think about compliance, and I quite often think about legislation, and I quite often think about what needs to be done to meet requirements, to meet standards. And that's a manager's responsibility to make sure, You know, that's what we do. We meet the standard. And if anyone's got any comments to add to that, then please do in the Q&A section. When I think about leadership, I don't think about people in a position of authority, but I think of people in position of influence. That's the way I see it.
Very nice.
And again, any
Mhm.
comments?
And we'll look for those in the Q&A. And Paul, I think the requirements, the legislation, that's a great place to start. I understand Australia has added, how should I say, punitive impetus, incentive at the board level, i.e. if there's a significant incident, somebody at the top could go to jail or needs to answer for it in a legal sense. I think you started in the right place. And it's, when I ride on an airplane, I rode a long flight recently. Somebody said, "Oh, you're in safety." First thing they said is, "I bet you not too many people are happy to see you coming." I said, "Well, I hope that's not personal." She said, "No, she thinks in safety is auditing and regulation and requirements and penalties when you get stuck." Right where you started. I think managing safety is more than just that. It includes setting up the physical conditions for success, having a safe, clear, well-equipped, well-barriered, PPE'd environment for people to work in. And that's really an active part of management. I see we've got a comment. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Michael, I'm monitoring the comments, and Michael here in Perth says, leading safety involves coaching and influencing your team and others to deliver positive safety outcomes. Managing safety is more about guiding and supporting organizations and teams to understand and meet minimum legislative standard obligations. Great comments.
Yeah, these are great comments, Michael. Thank you. Appreciate your thumbs there if you're on the chat, if you're on a cell phone. Continuing, we're going to have additional opportunities to chat. And again, it says chat icon on your screen right now. But let's go ahead and put any comments, any questions right in the Q&A, and Paul and I will pause and answer them, respond to them, include you as we go. Yeah. Here are the key messages in our presentation today. And you can see this for yourself. Despite progress in worldwide safety performance, and it really is worldwide, and that certainly includes Australia, significant incidents persist. COVID exposed weakness in operating organizations and construction, and the capability of these organizations to respond. Since COVID, and we're working probably several hundred engagements worldwide, a number of industries are suffering fatal incidents. So I'm giving you anecdotal information, but it's certainly true in oil and gas, and we've seen this in steel. We've seen it in transportation and infrastructure. And not everybody seems to have a handle on, okay, well, why is that? We think perhaps organizations are resource constrained and have been doing only what's necessary or required. Again, we don't presume to be wizards on this or have the complete data to make that assertion. But this is what it seems to us. To the point of this webinar, championship organizations, dynamic ones, are relentless in improving, even in difficult times. And in fact, that's when they're going after improvement the most. This obviously includes safety and their ability to respond to incidents. These organizations have a strong safety culture and dynamic, courageous leadership. By dynamic leadership, we mean a proactive response to minor incidents, variances, or weak signals before they turn critical. And by the way, we don't mean people not holding handrails or not the tops of coffee cups. We don't expect management to respond to every Band-Aid in a proactive way. But signals around system interruptions or burps, flares, these are the kinds of things that want to be paid attention to. Dynamic leadership is calling out what we accept rather than what's truly acceptable. And that takes some skill. By the way, it takes some courage, and we'll get to that. And then dynamic leadership and culture includes leadership at all levels, not just the guy or gal at the top, and certainly not just the HSE organization and the great people, including those on this line. And then finally, courage to pause the operation, courage to question the status quo and to cause positive change. Paul, if there's a question, nope, okay. You'll yell if another question pops up.
I'll definitely flag it. Yeah.
What I'd like to use for a few minutes is Formula One. and probably, I don't know, there are many race fans on the phone, and I'm not particularly a Formula One race fan. I certainly enjoy it when I can see it. But it is an outrageous high performance endeavor. Speeds up to 375 kilometers an hour. Cornering and passing speeds literally on the cutting edge of physics and human tolerance. 8G force on the drivers in split-second decisions under pressure. F1 is perhaps the most advanced and likely the most highly regulated of any sport in the world. Yet the technology advances every season, challenging the regulators even, and aided in recent years by digitalization, data feedback, and more. The cars, engines, components, and the drivers and pit crews are among the finest performers in the year, and they get better every year. Couldn't be a more dynamic every single race and challenging environment. And you know what? No area of Formula One has improved more than safety. And this goes back 60 plus years. And you could see the kind of things that they've improved. I mean, helmets aren't even required on motorcycles in many countries to this day. And there was 70 years ago, the barriers, the safe zone. I mean, the list of their improvements goes on and on and on and on and on. The safety measures for cars, drivers, crew, and spectators are multi-layered and constantly improving. And most have come from proactive and thorough application of lessons learned. And this is a topic that's very difficult for most organizations. And the bottom line is, without dynamic, committed approaches to safety in thin times or thick, the business of Formula One knows there'd be no racing. This is a great recent example. It's just a year old. And September 2021, the Italian Grand Prix, and you'll see the two top names in the business at that time, and they're still pretty high names. Hamilton exits from his pit stop wheel to wheel with Verstappen, right out of the newspaper. Hamilton had his nose ahead, but Verstappen had the pace. As they entered into turn 2, Verstappen was pitched onto Hamilton's car with both grinding to a halt in the gravel, the Red Bull perched on top of the Mercedes. And here it is. And what you want to know, if you can, on that right side, is he is literally resting on Lewis Hamilton's head. The accident was life-threatening. Max's car had ridden over the back of Lewis Hamilton's with his right rear wheel descending onto his head at high speed, but crucially being diverted enough from the full impact by the Halo cockpit protection device. And you can see it here, it's outlined in red. It's titanium steel, doesn't weigh much, 15 pounds, but it needs to withstand a force of 12 tons. And the crazy thing is, you're literally putting a steel object right between the eyes of a driver. So you can imagine this wasn't received real well. When the Halo was first introduced, the drivers, you could picture, you're going to put a pillar right in front of their face while they're driving. Imagine your operators getting something like this, even a crane operator, literally right between their eyes. It was resisted first. Max, the guy who was sitting on Lewis Hamilton's head in the previous photo, he resisted. He said, Formula One's, we're losing the element of risk. This doesn't seem right. And at first, Lewis Hamilton objected, but he changed his mind in 2017 when he saw some data that it would improve. Another driver, Romain Grosjean, a French, Italian, a French name, but he's Italian. He objected strongly. He called it a sad day for Formula One and questioned if enough tests had been done. So sure enough, this is F1, but I'll bet you can hear these voices in your own history. If you have any record of, hey, you know, I think we might need to revise our operation, or we might need an additional barrier in this situation, or during a turnaround, a shutdown, I think we'd perhaps put in another set of, and you can hear the voices in your own organization rising to object, including somebody like Grosjean. You know, this is a sad day. But only a few years later, a horrific accident involving Mr. Grosjean. His car in the first turn of the Bahrain Grand Prix in 2020 slammed into the wall and split in two. It's literally one half of the car is on one side of that barrier, and he in the other half on the other side. And he climbed out of that record with only minor injuries. If you Google YouTube Romain Grosjean someday, you'll see this, and it's literally a guy walking out. It's a miracle. He credited the halo, that device, for saving his life. By the way, here's another great example of great response by F1. Their study showed, they had very simple statistics that says that that a high proportion of accidents occur in the very first lap. And you know when this horrific accident on the screen happened? In the first lap. The emergency response vehicle arrived within 10 meters of this flaming mess, within seconds of it happening, not minutes, which would be a great emergency response, within seconds. You know why? Because the F1, with the data, they put a competitive race driver and an emergency response expert doctor in a high-speed vehicle behind the cars in every first lap. And sure enough, that car was right on the scene within seconds. Again, made a big difference in the response. The halo done, realizing it's the right and great thing to do with the data they had. And then this, hey, we're going to put an ER vehicle right in the first lap. Great proactive examples. Here's another sporting example. Again, under the topic of dynamic leadership and culture. This is the United States this time, and it's baseball. Baseball is a great game, and probably the people on the phone know enough about it without the New York Yankees. This is Yankee Stadium, a very famous place for, probably 100 years now in baseball history and sports history. In September 2017, a tragic accident. So like cricket, a very hard ball is hit by a wooden bat and at a very high speed, and often it goes outside the field of play. Unlike cricket, it's called a foul ball. In cricket, it's 360, it's all in play. And this one hit a young girl in the stands watching the game right in the face. She was taken to the hospital, underwent multiple surgeries. Thank God she recovered. And I think within a year or two, she's back 100% normal. A wonderful afternoon spoiled by a terrible accident. This is one of the coaches on the field that day for the Yankees. And you can imagine the impact, gosh, on her grandparents, and then even on this gentleman. Picture yourself being the next player, coming up to hit the ball, which you're paid to do, kind of releasing as with all full intent. What to do to prevent this reoccurring? How can the baseball league and Yankees respond? Here's one response. This is 10 days after this terrible accident in New York City. This is Chicago. And this man is a very well-known and well-liked coach. He's a good guy. This is not a bad guy and a horrible manager. Very similar incident. Fan was struck by a foul ball, just like the young girl. His response, fans know the risk. Pay attention. How many of you have heard a manager in your plant or company say something like this? Hey, workers need to pay attention. They know the right thing. They need to do the right thing 100% of the time. They know the risks. This is a traditional approach to incidents, focused on behavior and people and what should be done. This is not a proactive, and today, truly an inappropriate response. And those of you who are studying, learning, or implementing human performance, you know that behavior is much more a symptom than a cause. And that getting people to pay attention, although it might make sense rationally, it doesn't really when you get to a dynamic situation, much less high speed. I mean, in baseball, you're asking families to come to your event, to your park, pay you money for it, and then blame them when you hurt them? And by the way, you give them alcohol? How is that supporting their ability to pay attention, really? These are paying customers and guests in your park. It's really a truly inappropriate response. So, hey, a month later, cool. Yankee Stadium, netting will be extended. They have netting behind the plate where there are a lot of foul balls, if you will, a lot of tip balls go back. And they're going to extend that netting, you can see in the picture, all the way down the sidelines. Well, good for them. Except that girl getting hit was at least the third time that year that a New York City fan was struck. In fact, 2 years earlier, all 30 pro baseball teams in the US agreed to extend their protective netting 2 years earlier. And only some did, and the Yankees didn't. It took yet another incident. This is, in cultural terms for HSE professionals, it's a reactive culture. You know, the manager saying, oh, they need to pay attention. Safety is the job of the worker. That's even a little bit pathological. But in classic terms, this is reactive at best, not even proactive, which would have been netting installed years ago. You know what? The first time the Major League Baseball League, if you had to guess, when was the first time they had a fan get hurt and in fact sue the league, what year would you guess? Anyone in Q&A, just type a year. Baseball's over 100 years old. What year would you have guessed? Did we get anyone?
No, not yet. Yeah,
No one's typed.
Yeah, so Michael has said 2014.
You're going to go nuts when I tell you, Michael. I'm waiting to Paul see it. Ready?
Any other ideas? We've got several other people there. You've got Donald and Bradley and Kai and Lewis. What do they think?
Here's your answer. 1913. A USA baseball fan. Bradley, you just missed. 1913, 100 years earlier, the organization had more than a warning sign, not to mention an incident. Obviously, not a proactive, much less dynamic example of leadership, for safety. And truly the opposite of F1. And I'm not anti-American and I'm not anti-baseball. We're pointing to organizations, world-class plants, world-class construction sites. They treat their workers and their contractors' workers as family and guests. These companies and leaders consider themselves privileged to have workers devote their work life and their energy and commitment to the success of the plant and business. Rather than treat workers, supervisors as variables to be controlled, they need to pay attention. They see workers as the source of their business success and operating success. And the key, workers are the key to improving safety. This is where dynamic leadership and dynamic culture picks up from. So I've been talking sports, not process industries or heavy industry. But the examples from your industries are many, and likely you know them well. The Deepwater Horizon rig, operated by a global offshore contractor. It was, by the way, these big rigs, some of you may know, they do construction operations simultaneously. And they were on the construction side of this operating facility for BP. And causes after the incident, the worst offshore incident perhaps ever in terms of environmental magnitude, and I believe 11 workers were killed. I know that there are other offshore incidents with greater loss of human life. The causes you can see on the left side of that screen. The employees and contractors repeatedly ignored early indications of a problem, and they missed several opportunities to prevent a full-scale blowout. Some of you have seen the movie, and they dramatize the schedule pressure that the actors playing the owner or operator, that pressure that those people were putting on. And some of that is reflected in the causes of this. Decisions made by the operator were the cause of the failure to respond. And again, those decisions did not have to be made that way. And they had plenty of data encouraging different decisions. There's a good theme in there on collapsing personal and either process or system safety. If somebody's from the transport industry here or large infrastructure, you can think of it as system safety, process safety being very specific to containing the pressure, the temperature, the toxins, the smoke, the gas, the fire in the vessels you're managing, you're using. And then also lack of leadership. Similar incidents had occurred on BP-owned rig 2 years earlier, and not even that far geographically, certainly the same business unit. The BP CEO inflamed the public globally with his poor response. He was replaced within months. They'll talk about an impact on the lack of dynamic leadership. Again, a poor response. Similar, BP Texas City, 2005, 15 workers killed. All were contractor personnel. You can call it complacency perhaps, but a poor safety culture, a lack of response to repeated variances, incidents, signals from operators, signals from the equipment itself. The trailer where the 15 folks died was a construction trailer, and it was cited, some 15 years earlier, it was said to be safe. And everybody just accepted that. And year after year, when they went to do shutdowns and turnarounds, they just cited the previous finding. And sure enough, this trailer was, within way too close to the ISOM or the ISOM unit that blew its stack. Broken, ignored instrument gauges. So you'd have to get into it, but the workers were used to gauges that would have let them know there was too much material in that stack. And the stages have been broken. The gauges had been broken. They had ignored them, and they couldn't conduct the shutdown procedure if they had followed the information on the gauge. So they ignored it. It became acceptable. There are 14 motor vehicles within operating areas near the blast. Those of you in the process side of the world, hey, not cool to have combustion engines in a refinery, a chemical plant. And they're probably prohibited on your sites or sites you've worked in. Is that followed to this day? One of the big problems you have in a large refinery or chemical plant is over the years, more and more people, hey, let's get another light vehicle in there. It just takes too long to get over there. Repeated right sizing, the number of guys on the boards, the roster, the shift turnaround times, the shift turnaround procedures. Key signal of how dynamic, how resilient is our organization. Here's a proactive, a dynamic response. And some of you know this name and know this executive well. Paul O'Neill, former CEO and the board chair of Alcoa Aluminum. And he took the job in 1987 and he had it for about 12 years. He retired as chairman in 2000. Literally in the first days of his job, he prioritized worker safety. And by the way, he pissed off a lot of people doing it too, including his board at the time. But the company's market value increased from $3 billion just before his start of his tenure to $27 billion, 9 times. While net income increased from 200 million to 1.5 billion during his tenure. And he focused on safety throughout. A very dynamic leader. I'm going to show you a 4-minute video of Paul, and this is his earliest days on the job. Literally in his first month, he was confronted by fatal incidents. And he took a very proactive response right from the beginning. Let's watch. Paul, give me a heads up if you can't hear or this doesn't work, please.
So I'll tell you a story. Oftentimes, the things that move organizations are unfortunately not happy stories. But after I've been there, about 3 months, I guess, there was an incident at an extrusion plant outside of Phoenix, Arizona. And the circumstance, this is a night shift. There's an 18-year-old kid who'd worked for the company for about 3 weeks, and he jumped over a protective barrier that was almost as high as this. It wasn't solid, but it was a high barrier between his observation space and the machine that was producing extrusions. And this particular machine had a boom on it, and so with every cycle, the boom would cycle, and the machine was subject to jamming. The aluminum material would get jammed in the machine, it would be hung up. And this kid jumped over the barrier and pulled the scrap material out of the action part of the machine, and it released the boom. It came around, hit him in the head, killed him instantly. Had a wife who was 6 months pregnant. 2 supervisors who'd been there 15 or 20 years watched him do it. Actually, they must have taught him how to do it, because I don't think he made it up on his own. They jump over the barrier and pull the material out of the machine. And so I got the whole executive crowd together all the way down to the plant supervisor level. And we reviewed the diagrams and the machine process and all of that. And when we were done with that technical part, I stood up and said to the assembled crowd, "We killed him." Yeah, the supervisors were there, but we killed him. I killed him. Because I didn't do a good job of communicating the dedication of the principle that people will never be hurt at work. And obviously, our recruiting process didn't do a very good job, or our measurement process didn't do a very good job of assuring that people who were in this chain believed that safety was the single most important thing, actually not a priority. This is my counsel to you. Safety should never be a priority. It should be a precondition. Like before you can get up and walk around, you have to breathe. Safety should be like breathing. It should be a precondition for organizational behavior. I tell you what, the people in the organization were stunned by the idea that they should accept personal responsibility for this death. They all regret it. I tell you, there was never more caring organization in my experience in a traditional sense than Alcoa. Every person that was injured or killed, they mourned. Believe me, they really mourned and they regretted it and all of that, but they didn't understand. They were responsible for it. It wasn't somebody else's responsibility. It wasn't the vagaries of individual human behavior. It is a learned condition that you can produce zero injuries in the workforce.
Just a question first, and again, invite responses in the Q&A. You could just type in a few words. What were the visible and even the invisible factors that contributed to this terrible incident? So as a possible example, Paul said, there was a barrier this big, and the visible factor is the kid, the 18-year-old, jumped the barrier. That would be a visible factor. Maybe invisible factor would be, gosh, what was his motivation? He's new and he's trying to impress. Or Paul's conjecture, or a possible answer for invisible is, he might have been trained to do that. Again, you can't see, we don't know. In all cases, we're only hearing from Paul. But what might you suggest if you type in the Q&A icon there, you click on that icon, you could type in a few words.
Yeah, so we've got a response already from Bradley. Thanks, Bradley. The culture of supervisors.
And the culture of supervisors, Bradley, I'm going to use the word invisible, and you could type the word yes, or as opposed to visible.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right.
we got a yes, we got a Y there. Thanks, Bradley.
It's a funny way to do this. Sure enough, the supervisors were standing by watching, and the culture could be, hey, just get it done. Or real workers who, the real important workers are the workers who take risks. So I'm conjecturing, Bradley, as to what you might mean by the invisible culture of supervisors. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to add a few words to either the visible or the invisible?
So the other thing, Mike, I just Bradley's just put in is them ignoring his action.
There you go.
The other question I think is, what support do the supervisors get? Is that something that's invisible? And the other thing from my point of view, Mike, and maybe sharing this with others and see what they think, is what about peer pressure? The harden up culture that's in some organizations.
And sure enough, Paul, somebody just typed, as you were saying, peer pressure. We have an anonymous attendee a little bit further down in the Q&A who just typed, how do you change a culture where it's the exec at a facility in the central district team, their way or the highway? For example, 15 WHS issues, work health safety issues, when reported to the regulator by family of staff, the staff themselves, these were ignored pre, during, and post-COVID, and not just by the exec, but by the regulator. Well, this is Mr. Anonymous. Thank you for typing this. You got yourself a tough situation there. Let's face it. So again, to repeat his question, I think people can't see that. Only Paul and I can see it. How do you change a culture where the executives and even the regulators seem to be on the wrong side of doing the right thing? And then this anonymous comment goes on, how do you get execs and senior managers who don't want to leave and would go kicking and screaming just to change? Obviously, a tough question. And I think in partial response, it takes the kind of courage that Paul O'Neill exhibited when he stood in front, and I know he's the exec. And maybe that makes it easier in a number of ways. It does make it easier in a number of ways for him to stand up and say, we need to take responsibility. But I can tell you that isn't the words he used. What he said is, we killed him. You and I killed him. Those are bold words. Those are words that would get attention. And they come from a deep personal commitment. Now, again, to the person who typed this, I think you're courageous just to be in that organization you talked about. It looks like it's a hospital where the regulators and the administrator are culpable. And sure enough, you just typed, the people who tried to get the change happening were sacked. So certainly I'm not minimizing that situation. What do you do in an impossible situation? I think you give it a shot. I give it a second shot. You give it a third shot. And at some point you may need to leave. This is, by the way, where whistleblowing comes in. If you have a hospital on your hands, I would encourage you to go outside the system and into a public whistleblowing format, given the seriousness of what you've typed into this question. And again, I appreciate it. Most of us don't have that excessive a situation. You certainly have hard heads. And causing a positive change in the face of objections, like the F1 drivers. They're the rock stars in F1. Those are the guys in the TV series on Netflix. Not me, not the manager behind the scene. When you're getting hard-headed resistance from them, what do you do? And causing change in an organization is a great big topic on its own.
So Mike, I'd just like to say, I don't know who the anonymous person is, but, you know, if we're going to share contact details afterwards, you know, and if they want some advice, one of the things that I've experienced personally is when we go in making people wrong or with a heavy opinion, then we create opposition straight away. So sometimes it's our approach, an approach we take. And whoever anonymous person is, if they want some guidance on that, then we can have a conversation afterwards. But it's a challenge, and it's not just a challenge for them, it's a challenge in a lot of organizations. When the top person isn't enrolled in what feels like doing the right thing, that's a tough challenge, but it is one that we work on and we can get through.
Thank you very much, Paul O'Keefe, who just responded. And thank you for the person who's typing in these comments and being in such a tough situation. Paul's response, you've seen it. His key message about taking personal responsibility, more than just sincerity or even grief. But he said, standing up and saying, we need to change. It starts with us. We killed him. And he set about making substantive change in that organization. This is a great example of dynamic leadership, not just saying we're going to reach zero, but going well beyond to get at the fundamental reasons to why those conditions were persisting.
Yeah, so Mike, there's some great comments being made.
Okay, great. I'll pause.
Just picking up, going back to anonymous attendee. When the regulator won't step in, there's obviously there's problems there, and the thing for me is, again, that's going back to the approach and the conversations to have. Bradley just said there that safety is a precondition, and Bradley made the comment about we killed him. He picked up on that comment there. And Bradley, I'm not sure what you mean by we killed him. Is that a quote from the video, or is that
Paul O'Keefe? I believe Bradley's responding to the second question on the screen. What was Paul's response and his key messages? And his response was safety is a precondition. we killed him. Those are
Yeah,
some
correct.
of his key messages. That's how I'm seeing Bradley responding there. Thank you, Bradley. And thank you again to the, and Bradley just said yes. To Mr. Anonymous out there. We talk about leadership, so I wanted to say a few more about that, and you're going to get these slides. So the next few slides have a fair amount of information on them that Paul O'Keefe and I wanted to get across. So we're just going to highlight a couple things that's on your screen at the moment. And again, you'll get these so you can go through them. And when we look at dynamic leadership and culture, we separate, we have a 2x2 matrix we look at, and you can see that on the left side of your screen. And the two boxes on the left, personal and culture, this is the invisible part. And the two on the right, behavior and systems, are the visible aspects. So when we think about managing safety well, most people relate to the lower right-hand side, the systems, the policies, procedures, the contracts with employees, managers, and your contract staff, the metrics, the measures, leading indicators, all of that good stuff, the organizational structure and resources. That's how most people think of systems. And by the way, that's where HSE management spends a good deal of its time, and you should. Nothing wrong with that. Again, on the visible aspects of safety, most people then think about behavior, something done right the first and every time, or errors, whether caused by the system or individually caused, or even in malicious errors. So the action that's visible, the results that come from them, competence measurement, plans that are in place, you could relate to those as behavior. On the invisible side are personal values, attitude, responsibility, as Paul pointed to. And then culture is really, at a group basis, an organizational basis, the values, the morale, the covenants, the vision, the mission of the organization. Are they just words on the wall or a banner? Or are they, in fact, guiding the preconditions for operations? And we think that organizations that are dynamic have very robust systems, measures and metrics, and they're also highly resilient on the invisible side. And some of the best practices of a dynamic safety leader, certainly this is one of the first things you'll read in process safety management, that the people in charge need to understand their operation, learn both the hazards and the risks in that operation. But a few things we want to highlight is this notion of what do we currently accept? Small and minor spills, what happens at night versus during a day. Taking personal responsibility, we've touched on that. And we've also touched on today being a leader and a manager. And they're complementary, some overlap, but they're quite distinct. And a big aspect of being a leader is being enthusiastic, forward-looking, inspirational, someone who's capable of it and in fact considered it to be his or her job to cause positive change. Visible behaviors, you know, of course, go walk the talk, but spending time on, hey, let's go listen, talk a lot less. Take notes out there and follow up. How could a significant incident happen here? Let's go ask that question and follow up on the responses. How are our barriers implemented? And one of the hallmarks of a great organization, a learning organization, is ask, how did this happen? And understand that, not why. The question why often leads to blame. Again, a set of useful tools in your system or your process. What's the upset? What's occurring? And what's the observation from a process safety management or systems viewpoint? Is there drift that's occurred? So for example, that BP Texas City, they drifted from what could work over time. That trailer there is really a sign of outdated standards that, hey, we're ticking the box on. And the leadership and culture principle that's here. And then what are some great or even dynamic practices? For example, a drift hunt, not just a hazard hunt. And we'll send this out. There's way more information than we have time to talk about today. One that some of you will know the name Todd Conklin out of the US Department of Energy. He talks about a pre-accident investigation. Well, that sounds crazy. That doesn't make sense. Really? Are we inquiring as leaders, including in our role in HSE, as to that operation appears to be working? What's going on in there? Let's find out how it's working and why it's working before something happens, and see what we can learn there to extend to other units or another day. Dynamic leadership, and we're going to leave some time here toward the end to see if there's more comments or questions in the Q&A. Dynamic senior leadership will make all the difference in an organization, and then driving that down to all levels.
Mike, but before you move through these key takeaways, there's a question there from Bradley Harris about what do you mean by drift? Yeah.
A drift is, well, I mentioned, well, if you think of an organization that says we have a no leak policy, and yet when you go out there and they're changing valves, flanges, et cetera, there are small leaks. And now they may be into catch basins. Well, if it's really is a no leak policy, what are we doing here? Do we need to correct that policy or go after it? Or it used to be there was no leaks, and over time, when we do it after hours, that's become okay. So what used to be a couple ounces is now a couple quarts, liters. A drift is a drift away from what works over time. There's some great examples and they're quite scary in the nuclear industry, particularly nuclear weapons, where what used to be 2 people in every single operation handling a weapon that wasn't even activated, that they've drifted away from that over the years due to resource management, redundancy not needed anymore because we never had a problem, that kind of thing. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it did, Mike. Thanks.
So some key takeaways: going beyond the minimum, beyond the regulation, getting data and using it, like for the halo, or accidents occur, a preponderant number of accidents occur in the first lap of an F1 race. Do not delegate a commitment to safety or to improvement. It's one thing to contract out requirements. It's another thing to delegate inappropriately that intrinsic commitment to relentless improvement. And then follow through, race after race. This is how lessons are learned and implemented. Well, I think we have a few minutes. Maybe some another question you may have, or what you might be taking away from this. Maybe a new perspective or a thought you hadn't considered as a result of this last hour.
Something I'd just like to say, Mike, while we've got the opportunity, is when we talk about commitment, I can't actually tell if the anonymous person is still there, but what's showing through is their commitment to make a difference. That's and great. Them showing through their leadership. That's why I actually said, you know, that for me, quite often, having a conversation with someone to talk about options is really useful. And, you know, we do that amongst ourselves in our company. And I've just been coaching someone in India where they don't have the legislation. And so, you know, they can't go to the regulator, or they can't, because the legislation is not there. So how can we influence leaders? So, and that's why I said, you know, contact me and we see what we can discuss in the way of options.
Very nice. And Mr. Attendee is still there. Thanks again for being there and participating. And he added, hey, perhaps a new thought for him is leaders are inclusive. The listening aspect, the practices to go listen, learn, understand the risks, learn from others, are the barriers implemented. Thank you very much for your comment there. This last photo on the screen is from just this past summer, July. Again, that halo saving this driver's life. Literally, you can see it on the screen. I think are coming to the end of our time. I want to thank you for participating. I wanted to point out our email addresses on the screen, in particular, Paul's offer to speak, and that's not a sales talk. That's an authentic invitation to correspond, and Paul's actually known more.
Mike, just briefly, I was sorry, I put myself on mute. There was another quick question from Donald. Is dynamic leadership giving workers autonomy to make safe decisions without fear of being punished? That's a great question. A really great question.
And the way you've worded it, I think the answer is absolutely. Now, who decides what safe is? I think that a great practice is giving workers the opportunity, obviously, to contribute, to improve, ask them very simple questions. You know, who's run into this before? What are the problems you've had? What have you seen? Hey, what are chronic issues that we never get to, that leaky little pump that you've put an extra band around, even though that's not the procedure? So certainly those kinds of things, giving them first the opportunity to speak up and respond well to what they raise, but then absolutely making safe decisions. Again, Todd Conklin, name I used earlier, he talks about giving workers safe to fail endeavors. So you might not put them in charge of the most hazardous or the most risky procedure on day one, but where can you have people engaged in what he'll call a safe to fail operating endeavor, and slowly increase the autonomy and the authority from there.